It's not that. Actually, this album makes me want to just chill out and listen.
Chill out.
Chill out.
That's fucking everything on your list, bro.
It's not
All
everything.
you got is chilling out music.
All right. Okay. Well, maybe you should give this number 7 album a listen, because my number 7 favorite album of all time is All the Stars and Boulevards by Augustana. And for those of you who don't know, I recently, in the last 2 months, put out a video detailing all my top 10 favorite albums of all time. So if you want to check that out, I'll put it in the link below on YouTube, or you can just look it up on YouTube. But I go into detail about all of these albums briefly, but here on the podcast, I feel like we're allowed a little bit more time to just marinate on certain aspects of these albums. So All the Stars and Boulevards, a brief history of this album for me is we would go to Disc Replay and Half Price Books all the time. In high school, I was there at least once a week, just looking through their discount bins, trying to find $2 CDs, any CD that I recognized a song from that was like $2. I would buy it, I would listen to it, and then I would just keep it. Like I bought a couple albums that way. Couple albums that I really enjoyed, like this one, and a couple albums that I didn't really enjoy, like 4 by Blues Traveler. God, dude, I bought that album for like 2 songs, and then the rest of it is just, it's very bleh. But this one was kind of a weird case because I didn't ever specifically seek it. It was just an album that I saw all the time. I would go and I would see a copy, or at least I would see one copy of this if there weren't many copies. And I would pick it up every once in a while, and I would look on the back to see if I recognized any songs, and I saw one song that was called Boston, and I was like, oh, I think I remember hearing someone play that on like MySpace or whatever, on their homepage on MySpace. But I never picked it up because I was like, it's a chill piano song. Like I don't know if I'm into that. And every time I would come back to Disc Replay to find another album, I would always find this one. And it got to a point where I was annoyed. I was annoyed that I was finding it so often, because I wanted it to be like Ocean Avenue by Yellow Card, or like a Foo Fighters album or whatever. So eventually I caved, I bit the bullet, and I was like, you know what, I'm not going to buy it, but I am going to go home, I'm going to listen to it, I'm going to see if I like it. And I listened to it first time through, and I was very unimpressed. I was like, it's just a run-of-the-mill rock album with like one or two good songs. So I would go back and I'd listen to those 2 songs. And then on YouTube, they would always have in the recommended videos section right next to the video, they would always have like videos of another song with the same album artwork. So I'd just click on that. So I would listen to that other song that YouTube was like, oh, you might like this. And I listened to it again, and I'm like, yeah, actually this isn't that bad. And over time, I listened to all of the songs from the album, realized that I did in fact like the album. It just needed a little bit of time to settle and hang and marinate. I already used that word this podcast, so I feel very redundant, but that's a me problem. I ended up putting this in like my top listened albums, like when I was in college. Skip ahead a couple of years, I'd drive back and forth from school, and it was a 2.5 hour drive. I would always listen to a couple of albums that ended up here in my top 10 list. And for Augustana, obviously you have Boston, which is the song that everyone is going to know if they've recognized the name. It's the piano ballad, and what surprised me the most was that this album is not, like, Boston doesn't represent everything that this album has to offer. There are plenty of songs on here that are way, not even heavier than Boston is, but are more rock forward. Like the opener. Oh, the opener, which I believe is called Mayfield.
Come on, bro. How do you not know?
Yeah, it is Mayfield.
7th favorite of all time.
Hey. Okay. It's one of those where, kind of like with my games list, I listened to it a lot, so the music is kind of ingrained in my soul. But because I don't go on a whole lot of longer drives anymore, I don't get a chance to listen to full albums anymore. So, but this one I listened to a lot. Hotel Roosevelt is probably my album highlight here. I love the way that the drums kind of mix with the electric piano in the very beginning. And this song came out in 2005. I'm not kidding when I tell you that listening to this album, it doesn't remind me of being 10 years old because this is the music that I was listening to at the time, but it reminds me of being in like the mid 2000s because it's the vibe that it puts in my head. It reminds me of like watching How I Met Your Mother. It reminds me of like being in the computer lab at high school and looking out the window at like the fall trees. It reminds me of walking back home from middle school after asking my crush out, one of my crushes, and getting shot down. But like we don't have to focus on that part of it. Yeah, Hotel Roosevelt is a favorite of mine. Stars and Boulevards, the song, feels like this band trying to write a classic song in the style of like the Rolling Stones or the Beatles, but it kind of takes on a life of its own. The production on the album isn't the best production ever, but it reminds me of a lot of DIY productions that you'll hear today, where it's just amps for guitars, you have the drums, and you have the bass, and instead of trying to like make it sound as perfect as possible, you just let it sound human, and you just keep all of the like the human element to it. Like if a band like kind of falls out of tempo for a second, you just go with it. If there's a mistake, if you hear like squeaking on the strings, or if you hear like chords that don't play out all the way, I like hearing that kind of stuff, and this album has that all over it. There are a couple of slower, softer songs here. Obviously, Boston, like I mentioned, starts out on piano, but that gets really big towards the end. The song Sunday Best is always interesting to listen to because that doesn't ever really get big, but it kind of informed a lot of my songwriting in high school, because back then in middle school, high school, I always thought that songs had to have solos and big riffy sections, and this album was part of the reason that I got over that, and I got over that mental hurdle and started writing songs that didn't have solos or didn't have solo sections or didn't have riffs, and just prioritized interesting chord progressions and interesting melodies on top of those. This album singularly helped me make great strides as a songwriter and as a performer. So I really don't think there's a bad song on here. I think there are a lot of like 7 out of 10 songs on here, and the whole thing kind of mushes together and creates a cohesive sound that not a whole lot of albums that I listen to now do. And for some people that's a good thing. For some people that's a bad thing. Like I know with AC/DC, anytime I listen to like a whole album of theirs, which isn't very often, but I used to, it all just kind of sounded the same to me. And then they would release their next album and it would sound the exact same. And they just released an album a couple years ago, and guess what? It sounds just like AC/DC. It sounds, and I think there's a difference between consistency and, consistency with growth in your storytelling and your production, and then there's like copy and pasting. And I think this album, over the course of its 40-minute runtime or whatever, there are songs that differentiate themselves enough with certain instruments that they use or time signatures or whatever, but it all feels like it came from the same band, and I admire that. I admire that a lot. So Augustana, if you're listening, which, let's be honest, you're definitely listening, thank you for helping inspire me to write songs that made more sense for me to start writing, if that makes any sense, if that comes through. Listen to Boston. I know it was featured in, bless you, I know it was featured in the OC, one of those like early 2000s drama series. And give Augustana a shot. If you miss the 2000s, the early 2000s, this might be the album for you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Never heard it in my life.
I was just gonna say it's that's a whole lot of nothing out of you. I don't know anything you just said. Not one word. So. Well, and that's okay.
I'll listen to it tomorrow.